So I'm Michael Famighetti. I'm the editor of Aperture magazine, which is a photography journal published in New York. And I'm really excited to be here with Iñaki Bonillas and Yvonne Venegas, who I've had the pleasure of working with over the last year for this issue that we released about 6 months ago called Mexico City. For those who don't know Yvonne and Iñaki, I'll just give you a little bit of biographical information. Yvonne has shown her work individually and in group shows throughout the world. In 2010, she received the Magnum Expression Award given by Magnum Photos. She also received the National Creators Grant by the Mexican Cultural and Arts Fund, and in 2016 she received a Guggenheim Fellowship for her project San Pedro Garza. She was recently awarded the Jumex Grant to continue a series of portraits dedicated to the study of pose, which I look forward to hearing about. And she has published 4 monographs, and her work is held in many collections around the world. Since the late 1990s, Iñaki Bonillas has established a deep relationship with photography in his work. Inspired by the conceptual practices of the 1960s and 70s, he has gradually been isolating the constituent elements of photography while linking biographical narrative, classifying, and archiving. In 2003, Bonillas introduced the vast photo archives of his grandfather, J.R. Plaza, into his work. And his work has been shown at Casa Barragan, the Sao Paulo Biennial, the galleries at Moore in Philadelphia, the Amparo Museum, among many other venues internationally. These are truncated bios, so just for the sake of time. So Iñaki and Yvonne were both featured in this Mexico City edition. We did an interview with Iñaki that was done by Yvonne Ruiz that touched on kind of the broad range of Iñaki's practice, and that included his work with archives to his work with iconic architectural sites in Mexico. In one moment in the interview, Iñaki uses one of my favorite descriptions that I've heard a photographer use to self-describe, which is he describes himself as an attic photographer, ATTIC, as in the top floor of a building where you might store lots of dusty things. Yeah, just making sure it didn't sound like addiction.
Yeah,
but
maybe it has.
There may be that too. Yeah. And he goes on to say he's someone who's more attuned to what someone has forgotten in the dark room of what someone has abandoned. And I thought that was a great way for Iñaki to describe his process. And then the issue, sorry, I'm just going to, so this was the interview. And I'm just going to mention that we have copies of this issue for sale at Aperture's stand, which is somewhere over there in the photography section of the fair. Where should I be aiming this? It doesn't seem... you're blocking the signal, Yvonne. But we also included a selection of Yvonne's work with her father's archive, which I won't go into now because Yvonne will speak about this. But I just wanted to mention that this, the Mexico City edition is part of a series of issues of Aperture that we do that focus on different international cities, looking at the photographic culture there. So these are ways in which we can really expand our purview, reflect international histories of photography, and I hope that they are compelling issues in their own right. We've done them in addition to Mexico City, we've done them in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles. We're working on a project in India for next year. But these issues are so important for us in terms of influencing what we do after them too. They're about expanding our contacts, our networks. So they're really important because Aperture we're not only a magazine, we're also a book publisher, we do exhibitions. So it's great to see the kind of continued reverberation of these issues. And I would just want to mention that the Mexico City edition is one of our most popular issues in recent Aperture history. So it has been hugely popular in the United States, which is really exciting and for good reason. I don't know why this... Yeah. Okay. And so I just wanted to quickly mention this is our next issue, House and Home, which I thought we might talk a little bit about in this conversation because this is an issue that looks at the intersections of architecture, design, and photography. And as its title suggests, there's a kind of angle looking at the domestic realm. Since both Iñaki and Yvonne's work encapsulates architecture and the social landscape, I thought we might touch on some of these themes as well. We actually also commissioned Yvonne to do this portrait of Frida Escobedo, who's obviously a brilliant architect who lives here in Mexico City. And Yvonne did some work in Frida's studio as well. So the format, we'll have Iñaki will present, and then Yvonne will present, and then we can just have a conversation. And because this is such a small group, I hope that people will ask questions and that we can, really talk together. So Iñaki, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for the wonderful introduction. Yvonne, what a pleasure to finally be able to meet personally and to share this conversation with you. What an honor. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here. As Michael was briefly explaining, I'll try to show you a selection of works that I've done in the past, some of them in relation to architecture and photography, some interventions I've done to certain buildings in Mexico, and then also I'll be briefly speaking about some works I've done in relation to a kind of archive that I've inherited from my father. He died when I was quite young, and I've been trying to do some findings to recover that loss of memory, so I'll be showing you also some works about that particular enterprise. So this is a Mario Pani building in La Colonia Cuauhtémoc. I think it's Rio Balsas, where it's at the moment still standing. Is one of those lucky buildings that haven't collapsed in the past earthquakes. And I used to live here in this precise building in the early 2000s. And sometimes when I arrived late back home, I've noticed that several neighbors were maybe watching TV in the living room of the apartment where they had, curiously enough, placed the TV. So when I was just wandering around my building, just about to go in, I was very impressed by how this building suddenly transformed into a sort of a light box. When we are watching a film at home, we don't really realize the explosion of light and color that that room is experiencing. So I was just happily enjoying that rhythm, that chromatic rhythm of light and color from the outside. And at that same time, when I was living there, I inherited, let me see where, an film encyclopedia from my maternal grandfather. And every night he watched the movie that Channel 22 or Channel 11 was playing. He never missed the appointment to watch a film that was screening in these channels. And then after watching these movies, he would go to his encyclopedia and he would check that all the entries were correct. If he had seen, for instance, a Western film where John Wayne appeared and the editor of the encyclopedia omitted the entry of John Wayne, he would include John Wayne's name. So he was, in fact, continuing the work of the editor, as I am myself doing with what I've inherited from my father and my grandfather. But when I saw this encyclopedia, I thought that it was quite interesting what my grandfather was doing. We normally try to keep our errors or mistakes as far away as possible from the sight of other persons. We try to block them inside the closet if possible. But suddenly my grandfather was making all these mistakes kind of public, and we normally tend to think that encyclopedias are the law and they are complete and there are no omissions. And he was certainly showing us the opposite. So I thought I should try to mix this encyclopedia one way or another with the building where I'm living. When at that particular time they asked me to be out of the building when I inherited this material. And the owner who bought the building and kicked me out eventually managed to convince me, so I could recover my smile after being kicked out of that beautiful building, to do maybe an intervention in the whole building once all the inhabitants had left the building. So I did a project called Luminouses of Error, and I basically included one of those additions of the encyclopedia that my grandfather did in each building, in each apartment. So when you traveled around this neighborhood at night, you could actually forget about the building and see these chromatic rumors or murmurs that was going on there. So this is one of the first intervention projects I did to a building. Later on, while visiting an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, I saw an exhibition by a photographer I had never heard from, and Michael's going to be maybe punishing me for this, Benjamin Brecknell Turner. And underneath there on this huge caption that was standing outside the exhibition, I also read another name that was not familiar to me, Mr. Fox Talbot. So I took this picture. I don't know why. I kind of liked that it was printed in photographic paper, although it's text. I took it with me, and later on I started my research on who the hell Fox Talbot was. And there I discovered one of my favorite photographers nowadays. But not only that, he was the inventor of the negative printing process. But not only that, he was also doing some sensitiveness to papers, but didn't really manage to make the images be stable in the paper. And there I discovered that Fox Talbot had a dear friend called Herschel, who actually developed the fixer for the prints Fox Talbot was trying to do in the early or late 19th century, early 20th century. And I was in shock to learn that I was actually born in a street in Colonia Anzures named Herschel. So without knowing it, I had been growing up for 17 years in the street of the inventor of the fixer. And basically, thanks to this guy, we are now completely overwhelmed with photographs, because these two colleagues managed to invent the negative, and then every single picture can be endlessly reproduced. And then Herschel managed to transfer them to posterity one way or another. So at that time, I was invited to do a show at the Galería de Arte Mexicano. It was my first show in a gallery in Mexico. This is 2003. And I did just a word game between this first image that I showed you, Photographic Views from Nature by Benjamin Brecknell Turner, based on Mr. Foxtalbot process. And what I did was just to switch some words there and transform this caption into something that read Photographic Views from a Wall, as you can see in this wall, taken by Iñaki Bonillas and not Benjamin Brecknell Turner in 2001. And this particular space in Galería de Arte Mexicano, it was not actually a place where artists were exhibiting their work. It was more sort of a showroom where several pieces of furniture were there stocked for the galleries to put works on paper. And the colors of the walls were kind of cream color, not average white as you would expect in a gallery. And also the lighting features were light spots that were illuminating the walls from the ceiling. So I basically removed those lighting features and I painted that wall that is kind of dividing the space in halves in white and then illuminated it as if it was a billboard, an empty billboard from the ones we see endlessly in these streets in Mexico that are kind of praising to find an image for it, but they don't really manage to do so. So I took a photograph of this wall, which, by the way, has more or less the proportions of a negative film. I took a photograph with a negative film, and then I went to a photographic lab, and I just asked them to continue with Mr. Foxtalbot investigation. Why don't you just reproduce from an original matrix, from a negative, in all the possible positives way you could do so. And I was stunned to see that even though all these images came from the same source, from the same matrix, every time I switched from one material to another, that pristine yellowish white wall turned into something else. And that's what I think it's interesting about photography. It's always a sort of a collaboration between the printer and the producers of the materials you are actually using. You don't have that much control, even though you are always printing from the same source. So it was my kind of early homage to Robert Ryman in photographic terms. And also to pay an homage to another important figure of photography, I did these sorts of daguerreotypes from the gallery windows of Galería de Arte Mexicano. If the history of photography more or less runs from direct positive printing from a negative, I wanted to include those both origins in my show. So with the typical paper used by architects to reproduce their plans, I just covered the gallery windows for several minutes, then developed these pieces of paper with ammoniac and ended up having a sort of a replica of the windows of the gallery space, as you can see here, a sort of a doubling, a sort of a negative, positive relation between architecture and light and space. And further on, I started working with another gallery in Mexico City called OMR, and this original location had a very curious condition. The building is kind of sinking. It's just about to collapse, just about to commit suicide in a way. If you measure from one corner of the gallery to another, the difference is of 70 centimeters. It's quite a huge impact to be inside that house. And it's not the only house in North Roma neighborhood that it's trying to recover its aquatic past. So I decided to do a sort of an archive of all these houses that are just about to sink, using a camera, medium format camera, that has a leveler included in it. So I would just position in front of a given house in the North Roma, level the camera perfectly, and then I would take a 4x5 inches plate of it, and then I did the same process in negative and in positive, trying to see if these two forces, the negative and the positive forces, were able to level back again these houses, if those two photographic plates were able to level again these facades. And continuing the investigation of architecture that is collapsing, I did a site-specific project in this building by architect Sordo Madaleno. It's located in Avenida Insurgentes. It's a collaboration between Sordo Madaleno and Augusto Alvarez. Thank you for but it's a collaboration between those two architects. And I don't know what you think of it, but looking at this building from a particular angle, it kind of looks as if it was a ship, if it was the frontal view of the Titanic, maybe. And some architects, friends of mine, had their office on the last floor, which it is a very strange place to have an office, because it's extremely lighted, extremely hot, and it's too distracted to have a 360 degrees view of the city. And while being here, I thought this is not a proper place to have an office. In fact, it's the perfect place to, again, transform this glass vitrine into a photographic light box. So with the camera and with the help of that barandal, I wouldn't know that word in English. Yvonne, maybe you can help me. Un barandal, how would you say that in?
The railing.
Exactly. Exactly. In the banister, I was positioning my camera and I was photographing the 360 degrees view of the city from that particular point of view. And then I was positioning those photographs on the windows of the space, but I was slightly shifting the images. So once you entered, you felt that you were in fact sinking with the Titanic. And the opening of this show was exactly on the 101 anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. So. Sure. And I'll just briefly explain one of the projects that I've done with the material that I inherited from my father. As I was explaining in my introduction, he died when I was quite young, 5 years old. And many of the things that I inherited from him, I started to pay attention to that material when I was quite old, in recent years, without being able to really trace where these things really came from. And this is a particular image that has been accompanying me all my life without me knowing who the hell this guy is. And it's like a strange feeling. I know this guy is kind of familiar. As you can see, I'm there with my father, and in the backside, that photograph appears. So, I mean, I know it was important for him, maybe it should be important for me, but I don't have a single clue who the hell was this guy. So I uploaded this photograph to a web page called Ancestry.com in the States, because my father came from the States. He was born in the States. And someone spotted the photograph, a cousin of my father that I had never met, and told me the name of this military man, called George W. Rollins. So then I thought, now there's a good starting point. I'm going to get to know who this family member of mine was. But to my complete shock, on the archives of newspapers in the States, I could find and trace, you can imagine how many George W. Rollinses. Even though it's a very weird name, it seemed that every possible human being fitted in that name. So suddenly I thought this project might not be about who the hell was my great-great-grandfather, but how a photograph that has been previously hand-painted and has been altered and its original identity has been transformed, maybe could be retransformed by me, and I could just find the perfect biography for this new character. So I went downtown to Donceles Street and asked the persons that still hand-paint photography if they could imagine this black and white picture in colors, and these are some of the results. So each George W. Rollins ended up having a new identity. And I could continue on and on, but I wouldn't like to steal the time of Yvonne, so we'll leave it here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Iñaki.
I guess you can forward. Well, oh my God, I wanted to hear about all this work. Okay, that's mine. So I'm just gonna show you also about things that I never actually show, because Michael put out the thing, let's talk about architecture, and I was freaking out because I'm like, I don't know anything about architecture, but I thought I could share with you the architecture that I grew up with and sort of some of the things that, as the I think how I understand architecture has more to do with ideology. No, because basically we grew up looking at things like that. My Tijuana girls are looking very happy looking at this. So I grew up in Tijuana, Mexico, and I grew up with a mother who didn't really consider borders very present. So she made us go to school, and we were born in the U.S., so we grew up in Tijuana in a Mexican Catholic school. I mean, I'm telling you this this is the visuals that I'm going to put on the background of my life story, because, I can't really say anything about these images. You just have to see them to understand what the problem is. No, okay. But why I say that is because my work is very much based on the idea that there are no borders, that the possibility of fluidity is constant, and I talk a lot about the moment between the perfect moment and the imperfect. I grew up in a photography studio, looking at images, looking at people coming in to be remembered as happy, jolly people, and what I came out of it with was more to do with how do I make this space and those spaces mine. And luckily now I've had the opportunity to do that while looking at the archive of my father, which I'll show a few images. But I just wanted to give you a bit of context of the spaces that are happening, that to me are Tijuana. This is an image from my project called Maria Elvia de Hank, which is a book that I published that you can see in RM or on my website. And then the following images are from my project called San Pedro Garza Garcia, which I actually did to accompany images of people. I usually focus on people, but I really find interesting that this was the first project where I included architecture and sort of the spaces that people lived in as part of the context of the people that I was trying to talk about, because San Pedro Garza Garcia has 150,000 people, and I couldn't just talk about the people without talking about the spaces. And I feel that looking at the spaces on their own and looking at the buildings on their own, you get the feeling of what people aspire, what people aspire to. San Pedro is the richest municipality of Mexico, and when I saw this arch for the first time, I thought, this is the mayor's house, and this is the people that this is the man that everybody wanted to have as a mayor, and I just thought it was fascinating. I'm like, what is everybody thinking? It's like, this is so, I mean, you don't even have to see the man to see that he has a different way of thinking about the world in general. So so all the pictures that I actually made a big effort to include architecture. This is actually a hospital. I love, the mountains that surround San Pedro sort of delineate a space that is always in your sight. Like when you drive around, you see always these mountains that are almost like a protective layer of the society. I find it really fascinating and exciting. And anyway, the homes, of course, there's many homes that look like suburban California, but then are not. They're in San Pedro Garcia, and this is the style or the way that people have created their environment has a lot to do with Texas. Actually, it has a lot more to do with Texas than it has to do with Mexico. Why? Because there's a lot of money and they're very close to it. Slowly I moved into some of the people that I photographed, and what I tried to do, as I said before, is like find that moment that is fluid, something is happening. I like to photograph, and what I realized while looking at my parents' archive is that I tried to photograph in a way that people look like they're not exactly prepared for the camera. I consider it a vulnerable moment. Not that I want to make them look vulnerable, accidental vulnerable, like, oh my God, you look so bad. Which is what I mean, that there's beauty in that because beauty is important to me. I did grow up in a wedding photography studio. But anyway, there's beauty to me in vulnerability. And so anyway, I wanted to share some of the images that I did of Frida Escobedo. I was very honored to be invited back to work with Aperture. They're a fantastic team. These are images. These are images of the spaces. I wanted to share what I did, the work that I did, but I didn't. I have to confess something that Brendan sent me a WhatsApp in the middle of a shoot and said, take details, because I wouldn't have done them. If you would have left me a message, I was really happy you wrote me, because they really are beautiful. I wouldn't have thought of it naturally, but anyway, these are the images that are included in the issue of objects of Frida Escobedo. But anyway, I just wanted to show you some of the images from the archive. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something? Yeah. So I just wanted to show you a few images from the archive because it's something. This is where my practice basically came from. To grow up in Tijuana in a society that was really just under construction. It was becoming a society. My father, as a wedding photographer, came. He's from Tijuana, but he went to study in LA and imported this format of color photography and the album into Tijuana. He was the first one to do this, and he was the first one to basically so he became a hit. That's what I'm getting to. But it was quite important for him to be part of the society. He was very eager that we became girls that were, the daughters of the Bustamantes and the blah 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 blahs. No, but to me, to see the work and to analyze the work is like almost like working on some kind of a long-term saved archive of feelings. And now I brought all the archive to Mexico City. I had a show recently at the MUAC, but I still have a lot more to look at. And it's like the 1970s. I don't care what happens to the 90s and to the 2000s of the archive. I have to confess I'm not an archive person in that way, but emotionally I'm linked to 70s and 80s because those were my childhood years and my teenage years, which is basically when I was going to these weddings as an assistant when I was 7. No, I was a 7-year-old assistant. But anyway, part of seeing the society as I was growing up, and it's now something that is still present in my work. And I practiced for 20 years how to take the pictures that my dad took wrongly. It's like, this is what I've been practicing at, and when I went back into the archive, I realized that, there's an obvious connection between, my dad already shot those pictures, but there I was, for 20 years practicing how to get that one moment in between the right and the wrong. When I see them next to my own work, there's a very strong relationship, and I love, obviously I love them. And I'm working with the same format. I'm working with a color, a medium format, etc. Anyway, this is the last one that I wanted to show you. And just to mention that project about pearls that I'm working on, it's actually called The Pencil of Nature, which is based on Fox Talbot. And I want to talk to you more about it because I didn't bring any of it, but I have to take you to my booth, booth S217, Conversación. Please come visit my solo booth. But anyway, it's like I'm very happy. I'm just so excited about hearing about your work. But anyway, we can get to questions now.
Thank you, Yvonne. Since I think we only have about 10 minutes, but I think it's so fascinating that you both, there's a kind of field of artists working with archives, and, when you're working with archives, I think there are all sorts of questions about the degree to which you're honoring the original context or the original work, and then you guys have this other layer of complication, I think, because of family archives. So maybe I would just like to hear from both of you about how you kind of, think about how are you recontextualizing this work, how do you kind of make it your own? It's a form of appropriation, but at the same time, the work is the work. So maybe you could kind of get into that.
Thank you for the question, Michael. One of the first works I did with this photographic archive that I didn't show you anything about it, but I inherited a vast photographic archive from my maternal grandfather. He took photography very seriously and ordered it in 30 binders done with leather, and he pasted very carefully like 4,000 pictures, and I've been working for that material for almost 20 years. And one of the first projects that I did consisted in rephotographing every single vertical picture of the files and keeping out of sight the horizontal ones. And I did that because I've noticed that the vertical pictures from the file were far more appropriate for portraits. And even though I inherited this family album legacy, what I've noticed it's that these albums were not strictly about the family. They were not strictly about weddings, journeys, birthday celebrations, Christmas, Santa Claus, and on, the things that we can find in these albums. It was basically a history about self-portrait photography. My grandfather had a very high idea of his looks, and he photographed himself. You can imagine how many times in how many different angles. Eventually I decided to do this project called 5 Minutes to Die, after a Western script that he had written for Hollywood, and he only translated the title. The rest he kept in Spanish. He sent the script, nobody answered back. But when I saw the title and I was working on this project, I thought there's 5 Minutes to Die going on here. In terms of the photographic process, what I inherited, it's like a brief history of photography that spans from 80, 90 something till 2001. So we can see how photography is being born, how it grows, and how it eventually dies before digital photography kills analog photography for good. But then at the same time, you're seeing all these portraits of a man being hand by hand to photography, being born, growing up, and dying. And I was displaying these almost 1,000 photographs in 6 gallery walls from a space in Mexico. And that was one of the first projects that I did with the archive, and I was pretty like in a strange, I didn't really knew what my grandmother was going to say about this, because her full life was kind of exhibited plainly in a gallery space. And it's been by far the most successful work I've ever done, but not because of the work. It became like the visual representation of all the Spaniards that came from the war in Spain to Mexico, as my grandfather and grandmother did back then. So then I kind of realized that even though I'm exposing the privacy of my family, what people do see there is their own private memory and affairs. They're not really seeing my grandmother in bikini. They're seeing their own family photographs stored somewhere in their memories. And also my grandmother was so happy that I managed to make a living out of the family album that she couldn't believe it. Like, I thought you were not that intelligent, she told me. How can you make some money out of this? She was really happy.
Great. Thank you.
I think that, I mean, in my case, it's completely comes from the experience of being there, I think, and just, as I said before, like, more like, it's more about the actual experience of doing it. It's funny because I apply even all the knowledge that I acquired in the studio into real life. Like, I still photograph a lot. Like, I did take the whole, I followed up on the craft, and this is what I do now, but now looking at the archive, it's also from a very emotional place. It's quite like growing up and being, it's more linked to memory, my memory of the experience of being in that place. I think it's great.
But you're re-edit, like I think you talked, just when we published the work in the issue, you talked, Yvonne, about how, you know, your father would produce this kind of, the wedding book, the kind of idealized sequence of pictures that represented all the different aspects of the wedding. But when but you're re-editing. And so could you talk about the process of re-editing the work and like what your preferences are and how you're kind of organizing it?
Well, it's actually, it's very, to me, I mean, I think it's quite simple maybe, but I like my furthest memory is my father editing the work himself and throwing on the floor the images that he didn't like. There were these mistakes, and those mistakes became, you know, my obsession for some strange reason. I became identified with those things that ended up on the floor. But basically, oh yeah, no, I think this actually would, well, maybe it would have, because the woman in the blue is not looking at the camera. You know, it's like simple things that make them into mistakes. Like, if you want to actually move back on the images, I can actually, I mean, I don't know if there's any of the actual mistake. Well, that one is definitely not going to be in the album because she's so unhappy. No, it's like yeah, so, and you know, like, but what I try, it's not that I only look for the mistakes. I try to find the ambiguous moments, the ones that are not clear. No, and that is it's a minor shift, because he would photograph later in the 80s. He was more specific. They were more specific about finding the moment. Everybody smiling at the camera. It's a little harder to find interesting moments for me. But the 70s were nice because he was barely learning his craft, and there was a lot of moments where he just went crazy and shot a lot, which was great for me because suddenly there was these images that are like, it didn't work for and there's one strangeness that I like, that completely takes a whole new, it creates a whole new world in itself. And to me, is what I was saying, is something vulnerable. It's something that it has nothing to do with preparation. And being from the area is the same thing that I see. Like, now that I'm looking at it, it's like you think about what we have become as subjects and as spectators or even spectacles of, you know, photographs, no? And then people didn't even think of that. Like, they were actually the glamorous lady just for the party. They didn't really think of anybody looking at those images other than the family. So I really am fascinated by those characters, and I think that's what people are connecting with now when they see the images.
And what are the plans for the project now? Because Iñaki, with the JR Plaza Archive, are you done with it now? I mean, you've done such amazing. I mean, Iñaki's approach to installation, I think, is incredible, and the way, so you've done these elaborate installations with the work. There's a book of the work, but is there another chapter with that project, or is that it?
Thank you. In fact, every time I have finished a work with the archive, I'm always shouting, this is the last, finally, I've managed to kill my father, I'm not gonna continue working with it. And I've stopped for 4 years, but now I'm back to it. I feel almost like an addict, now like an addict, but something really weird happened. My grandfather used to disguise himself as a cowboy, as a grown-up man, almost like a Cindy Sherman type of project. And just briefly, I bought a little archive of Life magazine, and there I discovered that he had copied many of the postures that he was doing photographically, disguised himself as a cowboy, were copied from several pictures that appeared in Life magazine. So now I feel obliged to do something with it because these findings don't happen every day. So, well, it seems that I opened the Pandora box and I cannot close it. So I'm going to shut my mouth and I'm not going to be saying it's the last project that I'm going to do with the archive, because then the archive comes again and tells me, don't forget about me, I'm still here.
I love that your family was like a group of proto-conceptual artists. It's like the most interesting family history. Did you want to add anything to that? We actually have to finish in like a minute.
There's a question over there in the corner. Yeah.
I'm curious, you both, part of your work deals with inverting the media and the subject. You're presenting a series of photographs now taken from famous photographers, where you're, as an artist, inverting the photography and the subject as well. And you're also, part of your practice deals with using the negatives as the final work. Would you care just to comment on that?
I just briefly will tell a funny story. I was once describing my work to a group of journalists, and I was next to a Finnish photographer. We were both trying to, Esko Maniko, maybe you've seen his work. We were both trying to explain our works, and I was saying back then that my work is somehow a collaboration between my grandfather, and that I was doing 50% of the work, and that he was doing the other 50%. And then Esko Maniko said, no, he's telling a big lie. He's just doing 10% and his grandfather did 90%. So maybe he's right.
That's great.
Just to finish on your question about what I'm going to do with the work, I hope I publish it with Aperture. And then to answer your question, I'm fascinated by the history of photography, and I am looking again at the photographers that influenced me and that my father passed on to me. So, and just the study of pose has to do with that. And self-portrait, I've never actually practiced this before, and I am now JR, like I'm now your grandfather, like I'm actually enjoying the self-portraiture, and it's amazing how easy it is to work. Like, I've never worked with an easier subject. So, I mean, I think that I'm learning a lot about just the performance of the pose. It makes it's like a whole other story that I hadn't explored before, and I'm really enjoying it. I mean, I think that would be did I answer your question? Yeah.
So I'm afraid we're actually out of time, though I know we could go on much, much longer. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Iñaki.